Hello and welcome to the recap for Lesson 2 of Scripting for Interactive Media. So this is going to be a direct follow-on from last week's practical session in which we started navigating the workspace and looking at how to use the camera controls. This week we had a look at adding content directly into the viewport and being able to move our assets around, rotating, scaling, and changing position. So we're just going to quickly recap on that, and before I do that, I have added one of these asset packs into my project. And in this case I just added these Infinity Blade Grasslands pack to my project. You can get these for free from the marketplace, and if you go to the free tab at the top, and then scroll right to the bottom, you can access these free content packs. There's more here as well, feel free to try these out, but I just added this one. I clicked on it, and I clicked Add to Project, and I've just added it to a new project. So very much like we did last week when we started our new project, I created it in the same way and clicked Add to Project, and then I now have that content pack inside my new project. So we're now at a stage where we can start adding content directly from the content browser and start looking at these position, rotation, and scale controls. So the first thing I'm going to do is, rather than be working in this default level that starts whenever you open up a new project, I'm going to go up to File, and I'm going to go to New Level. And we're just going to choose the default level. If you're working with VR, you can do that. There is an empty level, but that doesn't include any of the sky or any of the lighting, so we don't really need to use that. So I'm going to stick to default, and we'll go for that. Okay, so when you start up, you will have just some very basic content. You'll have a floor plane, and you'll also have a player start. So this determines when you actually press play, where does your player start within the game? And that's determined by where that blue arrow is pointing. We've also got the lighting source, which is matching the sun. And we've also got some volumetric fog and clouds, which is what's being created here. Okay, so now that we've got our very, very basic level, we can start adding some basic content and having a look at how to control them and manipulate them. So I'm going to start by having a look in this Infinity Blade Grasslands pack. And I'm just going to have a look in some of these folders here. Now I'm going to look in Environment, and I'm going to look in, let's have a look in Earth. You see, this is getting a little complicated to try and find what I'm looking for. I don't necessarily know exactly what I'm looking for. So what you could also do instead of searching through these asset packs is you could use the search features. And the search feature is very, very handy for this. So what I might do is I might actually just go back to my content pack here. Rather than have to search for exactly what I'm looking for by clicking through the folders, instead I could use the search terms. And the one that I'm going to start with is SM underscore. And SM stands for static mesh. And static meshes are all of our basic objects that we can click and drag to put them into the scene. And what it's done by typing SM underscore, you see that it's filtered out every single static mesh that we have included in our project. So that's a very quick way of just filtering those out. If you were looking for, say, just material, so materials are what gives our objects their color and texture, is that we could type M underscore, and you see that it then filters out all of the materials. We've also got P underscore, gives us our particles, and they're things like fire, smoke, we've got sparks. There's other forms of particles, but the last one that we would likely use is BP underscore. And we'll look at these later, but BP means blueprints, and blueprints are what gives us our interaction and our scripting. But for just now, I'm going to type SM underscore, and that's going to filter out all of my static meshes. Okay, so I'm just going to drag any of these in, something that will load up quite quickly, so we'll try just maybe one of these, this wall here. I'm going to drag it into the scene. You'll notice the texture doesn't appear straight away, but just after a couple of seconds the texture should load up, and then we can move around and have a look at our object in the scene. So it really is just a case, click and drag from here into your viewport. Now you'll be automatically selected with the position tool, so you can move this object around using these handles, and you just click on them, click and drag in the direction you want to drag them up and down. I'll just undo that. So position is very straightforward. We've also got rotation, which is right at the top here. So all of your transform options are across the top. So we've got right next to translate or position, we've got rotate, and it works exactly the same. The wheel looks a little bit different, so we've now got an actual rotation wheel, but you'll see it works very much the same. And it also gives you an indication of how many degrees you're rotating by. So it gives you an actual measurement of how much rotation you're adding to these objects. Okay, so then we've got our scale options, and the scale options do work independently of each axis. So what happens is if I was to scale up the way, you notice that it scales the wall and stretches it out. So if you want to be able to scale uniformly, then you'll need to click and drag in the central square, and you see that scales everything without changing the proportions of the wall. So those are our main ways of rotating, changing the position, and scaling. Now the hotkeys for these are W, E, and R. So they're right next to each other on the keyboard. W is your position, E is your rotation, R is your scaling. So being able to jump through between those very quickly is going to be really handy for laying out our objects. Now other things that we can do and are useful to know about are these snapping options. So you'll notice that when I was rotating that object, it was rotating by intervals of 10 degrees. You see when I'm rotating that, it only jumps by 10 degrees. The reason for that is that the rotation snapping is set to increments of 10 degrees. I can turn off snapping entirely, so if I click the box here that was previously yellow, and now when I try rotating, you'll see that I don't have any snapping turned on anymore. But what we can do is we can change the intervals. So that was set to 10 degrees. But what might be useful is to be able to set this to something like 90 degrees. So I can then snap it directly to right angles, which would be perfect for if I was making a building and setting up walls for that building. And the same goes for your position as well. When I move my position here, it snaps to values of 10, but I can change those, set them higher, and now it snaps to values of 100. Okay. So other useful tools that might come in handy when you start working with this are the ability to duplicate an object very quickly. And the way you would do that is you hold down Alt on the keyboard, and if you click and drag on any of these using the position, rather than move the first object, it makes a duplicate, and then you can click and drag that out the way. You can also make that duplicate using, say, the rotation tool. So mine's currently set to 90, so if I want to very quickly make a right angle wall, click and drag while holding Alt to make a duplicate. And now I've set it up so it fits perfectly next to it. So you can start building up your asset packs very quickly using this technique. Particularly modular asset packs, you'll see some of those have that term modular, and they're designed to be able to do this, that you can quickly snap your pieces together using those rotate options. Another thing you may want to check out is the ability to automatically snap an object to a ground plane, or anything that actually sits underneath it. So if you've dragged it into a scene and you want to make sure that it's sitting perfectly on the ground, rather than having to drag it back down, what you can do is tap End on the keyboard. So End right next to the delete key, and then when you do that, it snaps it to the ground plane. What is actually happening though is it's snapping to the object directly beneath it. So if I was to say drag this wall on top of this wall, and then when I press End, you see that it stops once it reaches that wall there. Now that can be handy, particularly if, for an example, might be you maybe had a table and you wanted to put objects on that table, is you could snap them to the surface of the table so they're perfectly sitting on top. So there are reasons why it's set up like that. Okay, so we've had a quick look at the main tools and ability to be able to rotate, scale, change position, and our duplicate options. Next thing we'll have a quick look at is the use of materials. And materials are what's giving our object their color, their texture, and we can go in and change these if we want to. We can actually click on the object. You'll notice there is a static mesh in the details panel, but there's also materials. In this case, the object's made up of two materials. So we've got the stone wall, and that's what's giving us this texture here, and then we've got the pillars, which is giving us this texture along the bottom and this stripe here. So what we can do is we can actually change these materials if we wanted. So if I start by filtering out my materials by pressing M underscore, that gives us our materials. If we scroll to the top, we've got all of our materials here. If I wanted to, I could swap out these materials just by clicking and dragging. So in this case, if I wanted to, say, bring out this floor material here, what I could do is, depending on where I drop it on the object, it'll change that material. So I can click and drag from here. If I want to change the stonework, I can change it to, say, a different type of material just by dragging and dropping. And depending on where I drop it, you'll see it actually changes which material gets affected. So you can actually change these out very quickly, and it gives you more control over your static meshes. You can try out different materials, change some of the textures and things to give you much more control over the appearance of your objects. Finally, we'll have a quick look at the material editor itself, and this will allow us to maybe change some of the parameters of the materials that are already applied. You can open the material editor by double-clicking on any material. So in this case, I'll just click over here. If I double-click, it's going to open up the material editor. We'll have a look at this in more detail next week, but for right now, the basic controls for navigating are to hold down the right mouse button. It allows you to then pan around and move through this. You can also use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out. And this is our first look at the blueprint editor and the structure that the blueprint editor takes. So all of this, you'll notice, is node-based, and these are connecting up through these pipelines. You can move any of these nodes around. You just click and drag on them to move them around and adjust them. The flow is going from left to right, so we're starting here. This is then leading into these nodes, which finally leads into our base color, our roughness, and you'll see here a normal. So our normal is what's giving us the sort of texture and bumpiness of our material in here. You'll see there are parameters that you could potentially change. So, for example, we've got a brightness control. If I was to click on the brightness tab, most nodes in the material editor have a value that can be changed. So in this case, our default value is set to 1. But if I drag that further up, you'll see that the material gets much brighter. If I just move this aside and have a look at our object over here, you'll see that the wall is now very, very white. And that's coming from that brightness slider. So it was default was set to 1, so we set that back to 1. You'll see there that that changed immediately. Now we could go the other way and make that darker if we wanted to. Okay, so I'm just going to close this. That's basically our introduction to materials. We don't really need to use them for too much else. Next week we'll go into a little more detail of some of the things you can do with them, particularly for the ability to paint in materials and have full control over which material is applied where. So I'm just going to close that just now. I'm not going to save any changes. So that was really our introduction for this week. There wasn't too much else to cover. We were really just exploring the different asset packs, having a look at how each of these asset packs are made up, how are the objects broken up, and how are they constructed. So what I'd recommend doing is having a look inside each of the individual asset packs, perhaps have a look at some of the demo levels, and start clicking around on the objects themselves, seeing how these asset packs have been made up, how have the demo levels been constructed. And you could start moving those objects around, rebuilding. What might be useful is maybe just starting to add to those and start thinking about how you might construct your own level using these techniques. So next week we'll take a look at the terrain editor, which will give you a sort of base for where you can start building up these assets further.